Welcome to the Fundamental Health Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Saladino. This podcast is the result of my relentless search to understand and correct the roots of chronic disease and illness. In this podcast, I will share with you everything I have learned about how to live the most healthy and radical life possible. Thanks for joining me on this journey. How's it going, you guys? How's it going? I hope you all had an amazing Labor Day weekend. And if you are listening to this after Labor Day weekend, then don't sleep on my stuff. Get it while it's hot. But I'm glad you're listening to it regardless of when you are listening to this. This is an episode that has been well requested and hotly anticipated. This is the bloodwork episode. So my friend Nathan Owens at Nathan=1 on Twitter, who you may know from the Answering Carnivore Critiques episode, and I sat down for a solid 2 hours and went over both of our bloodwork panels, multiple bloodwork panels from the last year in huge amounts of detail. We break it down. So you will learn a ton about this. I always get questions, which bloodwork should I get on a carnivore diet? And I wanted to create an episode to give people a sense of what things they should ask their doctor for, what things they should order on their own, and how to interpret them. This episode should not now or ever be interpreted as medical advice. Work with a practitioner if you have questions, but I think that it is empowering for listeners who may not have medical degrees to gain this information and understand what is going on in their blood work. And oftentimes they can then subsequently educate their physicians about blood work they would like, what it might mean, and what it might mean for them moving forward, and how it might affect the course of their care in a positive way. So because this is such a long, complex episode, in the introduction, I wanted to give a quick Cliff Notes version of the labs that I think are beneficial, and I will do it in 2 sets. I will do sort of the essential central set of blood work and a separate set of blood work, which will add flavor and flair to that and be more comprehensive, but maybe not needed by everyone. I generally get all of these blood tests, both the essentials and the add-ons, on all of my clients, and I feel like blood work gives us lots of information upon which to triangulate interpretations of health, predict future health outcomes, and make decisions moving forward. So the basic blood work panel that I would like to see on anyone, whether you are about to go carnivore, whether you've been on a carnivore diet for a few months, whether you're on a ketogenic diet, whether you're on a plant-based diet, whatever, consists of an NMR, which is a nuclear magnetic resonance lipid panel, or a basic lipid panel, but I would prefer the NMR panel. I do think it's valuable to get Lp(a). In the previous week's podcast from Dave and Siobhan, we talked about that. I definitely want to see a fasting insulin, a hemoglobin A1C, a comprehensive metabolic panel with a GGT and a magnesium and a phosphorus level, a comprehensive, a complete blood count with a differential, an HSCRP, a homocysteine, a full thyroid panel with TSH, free T3, free T4, total T3 and T4, reverse T3, and antithyroid antibodies. I really like to see a full sex hormone panel, which has estradiol, FSH, testosterone, DHEA, DHT, prolactin, morning cortisol. And if you're concerned about cortisol, I would also get a cortisol awakening response and perhaps a daily salivary cortisol profile. And then I want to see a PTH, as I talk about in this podcast, a PTH in addition to a 25-hydroxyvitamin D and a serum calcium level in the context of an albumin gives me a sense of calcium status, and I think that we need to think about that on a carnivore diet. I also find a uric acid to be beneficial, as well as a full iron panel, which will have ferritin, TIBC, serum iron, and transferrin saturation. We talk about that in this podcast. Red blood cell folate, red blood cell magnesium, plasma, zinc are also quite helpful as adjunctive measures. So that would probably be the basic. I know that's not a basic panel at all, but that would be the basic blood work. In a perfect world with all the clients I work with, I also get the following labs: a micronutrient panel, which consists of plasma, serum, and red blood cell micronutrients for a variety of things from manganese, molybdenum, selenium, etc. I like to see an IGF-1. Stephen Gundry and others have been concerned about IGF-1 rising on carnivore diets, but that is simply not the case, probably because there's concurrent ketosis. I see IGF-1 levels, as I talk about in this podcast, that are generally about the average or even part of a standard deviation below the average. So it's clear that we are not overstimulating our IGF-1 on this type of a diet. I like leptin as a measure. I like essentially to also add the more sophisticated measures of lipids, which we talk about in this podcast. These are sometimes the plant sterols, sitosterol, campesterol, cholestanol. Desmosterol is also helpful. And arginine, asymmetric dimethylarginine, symmetric dimethylarginine. That is all interesting and helps us really interpret the lipid panel well. A toxic metals panel in the serum is fine, I believe, to start, is useful. Fructosamine is another measure of glucose. Cystatin C, C-peptide, and a coenzyme Q10 level round out that list with a few others that you can add from time to time. I didn't talk about gut testing in this podcast. I'll probably do a whole nother podcast about gut testing. Like I mentioned earlier, I think hormonal testing is valuable, but serum levels are just fine to start unless you want to see a cortisol curve throughout the day. So that is the basic rundown on blood work. Again, we go into all of that stuff in amazing amounts of detail in this podcast. I just blew through it super fast. So if you didn't catch all that, re-listen, write it down, and I will do a blog post about this in the near future. Right now, I am deeply entrenched in the writing of the book, which is my main project, and I don't want to pause to do a blog post on blood work, but it will happen in the future, I assure you all, and I'll have all that written out again. But blood work is super fascinating. So that is the summary of the episode. Enjoy it. And check this out, you guys. I have a new sponsor this whole month. I am so excited to be promoting the work of White Oak Pastures. You guys are probably familiar with them. They are an amazing, amazing farm in Bluffton, Georgia. They are doing what is called regenerative agriculture, rotational grazing, and in doing that type of work with their animals, which are many, they have been able to create an environment, an ecosystem, which is actually carbon negative. They had a life cycle analysis done through the University of Colorado, and the scientists who looked at their carbon and greenhouse gas emissions discovered that they actually sequester more greenhouse gases in the soil than they produce. Ruminant agriculture, rotational grazing, regenerative agriculture, like they are doing in White Oak Pastures and really leading the way with at White Oak Pastures, can sequester carbon in the soil. What I am saying is that they get rid of more greenhouse gas than they actually produce. I did a post about this on Instagram using a graphic that they had shown to illustrate this visually, but the plant-based rhetoric that eating plants is better for the environment is absolute hogwash. I just like saying hogwash. I'm hopefully going to have Will Harris, who is one of the founders of this farm, on the podcast later this month, and I'll release it next month. But the plant-based agriculture that claims to be healthy for the environment is actually producing way more greenhouse gases than the regenerative, actual animal-based agriculture like they are doing at White Oak Pastures. All of their ruminant agriculture is grass-fed and grass-finished. This includes both lamb and beef. Their meat is delicious, and they have amazing cuts and tons of organ meat. They also have Iberian pork fat, which I will talk about. They have Iberian hogs. All of the other animals are pastured and allowed to range and roam. You should check them out. So the other awesome thing is that they are offering a discount for all the listeners this month. And if you use the code CarnivoreMD at their website, you'll get 10% off your order. The other thing I will say is that if you live on the West Coast, we are still working together with them to figure out how to get the West Coast shipping to be reasonable. This is mostly for my peeps in the middle of the country on the East Coast. Shipping there is no problem. They want to keep your order fresh, and so it's quite expensive for them to ship to the West Coast right now, and we're trying to work that out. But believe me, I live on the West Coast, and I want to be able to buy their stuff all the time. I want my friend Tommy Wood and Nathan and all my other friends on the West Coast to be able to buy their stuff. So we're going to figure this out with them. But for now, if you are on the West Coast and you go to get some stuff from White Oak Pastures, the shipping is going to be expensive if you get a big order. I'm just going to warn you, because we haven't quite figured out with them how to make that affordable. But if you're in the middle of the country or you are on the East Coast, you are in super luck, because White Oak Pastures will ship to you fast, and these shipping will not be terribly expensive at all. But use the code CarnivoreMD for 10% off. Their slogan is radically traditional farming. How cool is that? Like, match made in heaven. So again, I reached out to them. I wanted them to be a sponsor. I wanted to promote their stuff. I believe in them full-heartedly, which I do with both of my sponsors. And so check out White Oak Pastures. I will be talking about them much more in the future. The other sponsor is the tried and true, the wonderful folks at Ancestral Supplements, who, as you know, are making grass-fed organ complex supplements from New Zealand, which are encapsulated into gelatin. This week, I want to tell you about the thymus. The thymus is an organ that is in your sort of central chest, and it's involved in immune function. They make a thymus extract. I have thymus in my freezer from White Oak Pastures. I'm thawing it out, but I don't have it all the time. When I don't have that, I do take the thymus extract. So because the thymus is involved in immune signaling, the programming of the immune system, there are unique factors in the thymus that are involved in the immune response. There are peptides such as thymosin, thymopoietin, serum thymic factors that regulate and strengthen immune system and immune health. And it's very likely that taking a thymus extract could be good, could improve our immune function. So check it out. Let me know what you think. They are at ancestralsupplements.com. You can use the code SALADINOMD on their Shopify site. They are putting back in what the natural world has left out. So I appreciate both those people. They go hand in hand. They are great folks. And if you cannot get organ meats, or you don't want to eat organ meats, check out Ancestral Supplements. And if you want amazing meat and organ meats, then you should go to White Oak Pastures and check out their stuff and use the code CarnivoreMD there. So that is it for today, guys. Check out this Bloodwork podcast. Enjoy it. And as always, listen to the end of the episode in the after episode for all the cool stuff that is happening with me. Nathan, welcome back to the podcast, my friend.
Great to be back.
Thanks for coming on. I think that anyone who listens to this podcast will know that you and I did a previous episode, which was super popular, that I titled Carnivore Critiques Answered, in which we sort of walked through many of the common critiques or criticisms that are leveled at the carnivore diet. So if people want to get more of you, they can listen to that episode. And if people are interested in our answers to common carnivore critiques, specifically from Chris Kresser and Joe Colin of Self-Hacked, they can listen to that episode. But you also have a podcast now, right?
Yeah, I've recently launched a podcast with my friend Nick called Root Causing Health, and we're going to deep dive about the root causes of chronic disease, starting with atherosclerosis. We recorded episodes with Nadir Ali, Gabor Ardosi, and some other folks, and hopefully we can get you on and some other folks as well. But expects us to dive deep, and maybe even deeper than Paul does on his podcast.
That sounds awesome. See. These are Nick and Nathan are both software engineers, super smart guys, and will carry on the tradition of software engineers being brilliant minds in this space and really thinking about things from a systems perspective, which is quite helpful. So I'll be curious. I'll be definitely listening to your podcast. So
Great.
Root Causing Health, and it'll be on iTunes and all that stuff, right?
Yep.
Cool. All right. So today, you and I are seated in the UCSD Medical Library. I'm having flashbacks to medical school. I'm feeling like I never am going to finish school, and I have to remind myself that I'm done with medical school and I'm done with residency, and I'm not actually in school right now, and embrace being here at UCSD in the medical library. But one of the questions that I get a heck of a lot is, which blood work should I get on a ketogenic or carnivore diet? And since you've had a bunch of blood work, which is really unique, and I've had a bunch of blood work, which is really unique throughout our collective time doing carnivore diets, and you had a keto phase prior to your carnivore diet, right?
Yep.
We're going to go through all of our blood work and talk about what I think is useful, what's not useful. And I want to give people a sense of what some of these values mean. This is in no way, shape, or form meant to be a substitution for working with your physician, but I do want to empower people to understand which tests to ask for and have some sense of what some of these blood work values mean, because it's a pretty powerful tool. So just at the outset, for people that are short on time, I'm going to give a list of what I think are the most valuable blood work tests. So this is kind of the high value content right at the beginning. And then I will give a list of blood work that I often do on clients of mine that is extracurricular, extra credit, but maybe not as critical in the beginning, and go from there. And you and I have both had kind of a mix of what I would consider to be crucial central blood work and some blood work, which is really kind of just academically interesting.
Yep, exactly.
So in terms of basic blood work, and this will be basic only in our relative terms right now, rather than the mainstream medical establishment's relative terms of blood work, I would say for comprehensive basic blood work, which is clearly an oxymoron, but the blood work that I would recommend to people, if they were going to do a ketogenic diet, if they're going to do a carnivore diet sort of before and then maybe at 30 or 45 days, would consist of the following: an NMR lipid profile, which is a nuclear magnetic resonance lipid profile, which we will talk about what that is, and a basic lipid profile. So when we go through our labs, we'll talk about how those two are different. But
I would note that you can also do a lipid ion mobility, which is a similar test to the NMR, or a lipid subfractionation. Different labs offer different things. I think LabCorp tends to do NMR, Quest Labs tends to do ion mobility. These will get you basically the same results.
And we'll talk about what that means and how it's different than a basic lipid panel. But the basic lipid panel, while valuable, is good, but an NMR or one of these other more sophisticated types of lipid panel is a good start. In addition to that, I would probably add an LP(a) for people. We'll talk about that some. You want to have insulin sensitivity markers. This would be fasting insulin, hemoglobin A1C, and fasting glucose. You want to get a comprehensive metabolic panel, which is different than a basic metabolic panel. You want to get a comprehensive metabolic panel, to which I would add a GGT, which stands for gamma glutamyl transferase. We'll talk about that. You would get a complete blood count, which is abbreviated a CBC with a differential. So a CBC with diff. I would get an HSCRP, which is a high sensitivity CRP. I would get a homocysteine level, which is sometimes abbreviated HCY. I would also get a full thyroid panel. Most physicians will just order a TSH, and I would get a full thyroid panel, which will consist of a TSH, which is a thyroid stimulating hormone, free T3, free T4, and antibodies, as well as total T3 and total T4. And the antibodies would be anti-TPO and anti-thyroglobulin. We will go into all of that, but I am not satisfied with just a TSH. And ideally in the beginning, I think it's also valuable to have a reverse T3. I would get a hormone panel, which we will talk about. I think it's actually pretty reasonable to do just serum levels of hormones. There are multiple hormone panels out there, like a Dutch, which is a dried urine hormone panel. I don't think you need to do this unless you're looking at very specific issues. And as I mentioned on a previous podcast with Tommy Wood, urine testing is not good for androgens, that is testosterone and related androgenic hormones. So if you're interested in androgens, you need to get serum levels. Urine can be okay for other hormones, but to really complete the picture, I think you can just get serum hormones to start. And we'll talk about both mine and Nathan's serum hormones. Neither of us has done a dried urine hormone panel. To the hormone panel, I would add a uric acid, which is something that I did a mini podcast with Amber O'Hearn about, and an iron panel, which again is a number of measures. An iron panel should include all of these, but it would be a TIBC, which is total iron binding capacity, ferritin, transferrin, and serum iron. To those, I would also add a serum level of coenzyme Q10 at least once, an RBC, which is a red blood cell folate, and an RBC magnesium level. So that would be kind of the basic panel of blood work that I would like to see on anyone. You can get a lot out of that. Again, it's not very basic. There's a lot in there, but that's the basic stuff. Anything you'd add to that, Nathan?
No, I don't think so. I think most of these can be ordered online through places like Request a Test or Private MD Labs or WellnessFX. All of these could be had for on the hundreds of dollars if you aren't able to get your doctor to order these. Some of these may be best bought as a package, and maybe we can link to some stuff. But
yeah,
I think that's a pretty comprehensive initial bout that would allow you to troubleshoot anything going on if there's things out of whack there that you can follow up on.
One of the labs I use for my patients is True Health Diagnostics, and they're quite affordable. I can get a panel like this for someone. Usually it'll be entirely covered by insurance. I've done it myself on a cash pay basis, and it's very, very affordable. So in terms of extracurricular labs, things you could also look at if you really want to dig into it, that I will do with my patients when we're really trying to figure out a problem or really want to dive deep, I would add a full micronutrient panel, which we'll talk about a little bit. There are a variety of ways to do micronutrient panels. I would add IGF-1, which is insulin-like growth factor 1. I would add leptin. I would add a little bit more sophisticated lipid panel stuff, which we'll talk about. Again, True Health talks about these things like desmosterol, which is a cholesterol precursor. I talk about that in a podcast with Tommy Wood a little bit. The second podcast with Tommy Wood, which should be out by the time this podcast comes out or the following week. I would get a heavy metals profile, which can really just be obtained in the serum, and we'll talk a little bit about that. I would get a fructosamine, which will complement hemoglobin A1C, which I should have added to the basic list. That was the one thing I left off the basic list, guys. I apologize. Hemoglobin A1C. I think I said that actually. So fructosamine will complement hemoglobin A1C. You can get a cystatin C, which is another measure of renal function, and that will complement the creatinine and the BUN from the comprehensive metabolic panel. And you can get a C-peptide, which is a little bit more stable measure of insulin. And you could get a little bit more sophisticated measures of things like hormones, like a Dutch, or you could even get GI testing. That's something I commonly do with clients. So that would be something like a GI map to look at gut flora and stuff. We will not talk about that in this podcast. We're just going to talk about blood work today, but there are multiple other tests that we can do beyond. I'm not sure people need that in the beginning. If they have GI issues, I think a GI test is valuable. So, all right. So that is a rundown on what I would order. I will do a blog post on my website, which is carnivoremd.com, which I will release when this episode comes out that you guys can look at. It will probably be carnivoremd.com/bloodwork will be the website link, and you can get all of those blood tests sort of listed somewhere. Again, I will just reiterate that this podcast should not be a substitution for discussing this with your physician, but I think it's cool to kind of demystify it all. So maybe we should dig into it. Nathan, what do you think?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, so let's start with some of your blood work, and let's start with cholesterol.
All right.
So your cholesterol pattern has been pretty interesting. You've had a number of cholesterol panels. Let's talk about how your cholesterol changed from pre-keto to keto and what we make of it all.
Yeah, so my cholesterol pre-keto that I had tested sometime in 2016, I believe, my total cholesterol was 177, HDL 67, triglycerides 145, LDL was 81, and then that changed on keto to my total cholesterol going up to 343, HDL of 94, triglycerides of 57, and LDL of 240. Okay.
And for the first panel that was pre-keto, let's just clarify, that was a fasting lipid panel and you had triglycerides of 145 on a fasting lipid panel.
Let's assume that that's the case. I don't actually recall, but it was potentially likely. I was a little overweight there.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. So we can talk about your sort of body composition changes over the last few years in the context of all these lipid panel changes. But as we will discuss, I think triglycerides are the most valuable marker. If I had to pick one marker on a lipid panel, triglycerides are very valuable, and it's quite interesting to see the triglycerides drop to 57 when you went to a ketogenic diet. Now, we shouldn't mention, this is a basic lipid panel. These numbers are in milligrams per deciliter. We are looking at a density measure of lipids here, and the total cholesterol is sort of a sum of HDL, triglycerides, and LDL, and then they're subfractionated into the HDL, which is high density triglycerides and low density lipoproteins.
And it's worth noting that these tend to be calculated. The actual LDL value is done using the Friedewald equation, which uses the measured value of HDL and triglycerides to estimate the LDL. So if triglycerides are very high, this can skew that off. If LDL is very high, it can skew it. Only certain tests actually do direct LDL-C measurements, and you'll generally see that tagged as like LDL direct.
Yeah, it'll actually say LDL-D instead of LDL-C, right? And so if your lipid panel says LDL-C, it's probably a calculated LDL, which is valuable, but not as accurate. So what happened to your basic lipid panel when you went carnivore?
Yeah, as I went carnivore and lost weight, my total cholesterol went up to 630 at its peak. It's now down to 485. My HDL stayed the same in the 90s, and my triglycerides stayed in the 60s this whole time.
So you've had 3 blood tests in the time that you've been carnivore. Your first blood test was November of 2018. Then you had one in February of 2019. And then you had one recently on July 24th, 2019, right?
Yep.
And so what we saw, interestingly, was that when you went carnivore and lost a lot of weight, your total cholesterol went way up and your LDL went way up, right?
Sure did. Yeah, it went really high.
So LDL now has been measured. What sort of LDL numbers have you seen here?
Because of the flaws of the test and the calculated measure, I only actually have one direct LDL test, and that came back at 504. The others can only say greater than 350.
Right. And this is milligrams per deciliter. And again, when you had that 504 for your LDL, what was your HDL?
The HDL there was 97.
And your triglycerides were?
72.
Okay. So many physicians, when they see this number, would say to you, you need to go on a statin right now.
My physician did say that to me.
Okay. But as many listeners may be familiar with, neither Nathan nor I believes that LDL is directly toxic to the endothelium, nor do we believe that an LDL of 504 is necessarily bad. But I would add that we have been so indoctrinated in our culture by our physicians, by our media. Physicians have been so indoctrinated that most people, when they see that LDL, think you have familial hypercholesterolemia, which you clearly do not.
I do not, because I have pre-keto numbers which show that. And I've also done a whole genome sequence, and I have no interesting lipid metabolism genes.
Right. So just for people listening, they will hear that familial hypercholesterolemia is a genetic issue. It's a genetic polymorphism. There are many polymorphisms which can occur for familial hypercholesterolemia, over 2,000. But you do not have any of those on your whole genome sequencing.
Not that I've been able to find. I only looked at 300 or 350 that were tied to lipid metabolism that I could find, but nothing interesting.
But to have an LDL of 81 prior to this suggests you do not have familial hypercholesterolemia.
Correct. And my family members, prior to their low-carb diets, also had normal cholesterol. So there's no familial aspect either, just some diet-induced hypercholesterolemia.
And my postulate would be that that's not a bad thing. That is an indication of energy metabolism. That is an indication of ketones and other biometabolites being made into cholesterol, and that's not a bad thing. And so I've done lots of podcasts on cholesterol, and we're not going to go too deep into this so that we can get into all the blood work, but Nathan's labs are quite striking. And so, but you will notice that his triglycerides have remained low, his HDL has remained low. So this is interesting in and of itself, and we could speculate about why the LDL went up quite so high on a carnivore diet, but it probably had to do with weight loss, maybe more fat, although you were probably eating a lot of fat on keto. Any thoughts about why your LDL went up so high when you went carnivore?
Yeah, I think I'm just a good example of Dave Feldman's so-called lean mass hyperresponders. I have been down below 14% body fat, and I'm very active. I'm riding my bike all the time, exercising a lot. And I think the energy metabolism side makes a lot of sense. And just the change to fat metabolism, I think, has a lot of impact there. And, folks should check out Dave Feldman's work if they're not already familiar, to learn about the energy model that he has developed, and makes a lot of sense to me. I'm not sure that it's the whole picture, but it's a good chunk.
And by the time this podcast comes out, I should have already also released a podcast with Dave Feldman and Siobhan Huggins, which would be the second podcast I did with Dave, in which we talked about that a little bit. As people will see with Dave's work, there is something he's noted called an inversion pattern, whereby the more fat that he's eating, the less his LDL tends to be. And if he fasts, the LDL tends to go up. It's sort of the hypothesis that perhaps the LDL is going up in people with lean mass hyperresponder phenotypes because it's a traffic of energy, and this LDL lipoprotein particle is moving energy. If you are burning fat, if you are running on fat, you are going to see fat in the lipoprotein particles in circulation, and that may not necessarily be a bad thing. I don't know if Dave would necessarily agree with this metaphor, but one of the things I've thought to characterize this in the past is that if you have a diesel car and you look in the fuel line, you will find diesel in the fuel. And so if you are running on fat, like we are on a carnivore or ketogenic diet, you will find lipoprotein particles like LDL carrying triglycerides and cholesterol in your bloodstream. And that may be part of what's going on here. So let's dig into a little bit how we can get more granular with the lipids, Nathan. So this is the basic lipid panel. Let's talk a little bit about a sophisticated lipid panel, one of these nuclear magnetic resonance lipid panels, or some of these others you mentioned.
Yep. So with the NMR panel, you tend to get something like LDLP, which is the particle count of LDL. And sometimes if you do ion mobility or other tests, you'll also get small LDL, medium LDL. From that, you can tell the peak size of the LDL and your LDL pattern, whether you're pattern A or pattern B. Generally, pattern B is the atherogenic pattern type, but many people will say simply a high particle count is atherogenic. But I think, as Paul said, it's not clear that that's really the case. But my LDLP ranged from 2100 to up to over 3500, and now it's staying about the same in the 3500 range, which is actually the maximum for the test.
Yeah. So the nuclear magnetic resonance is now looking at numbers of LDL particles. The basic lipid panel looks at LDL, HDL, triglycerides in milligrams per deciliter, which, as we suggested, is a density measure. And now we're actually counting the number of LDL particles. So instead of weighing the LDL particles, we are counting the LDL particles. And the idea here is that if you have a bathtub, you can fill the bathtub with sports, with balls of various size. You can fill it with basketballs or you can fill it with tennis balls. And you could fill the same volume and have the same weight of tennis balls and basketballs, but they are very different looking particles in terms of size and number.
And that's generally referred to as discordance in your particle numbers. If you have low LDL, but a high particle count, that's generally considered more atherogenic than not.
And I think we should make a comment about this. Many in the mainstream lipid sphere, I think, would suggest that that is because there are more particles. And I think that both Nathan and I would object to that with the counter hypothesis that perhaps what we're seeing in many people who have high particle counts, or I should say large numbers of small particles, is a reflection of insulin resistance.
Exactly.
And that's generally what's been discussed in literature. And that is sort of a theme of my thinking, and I believe Nathan's thinking, and Tommy Wood's thinking, many people that I talk to, though I'm not trying to exist in an echo chamber. I will interview Spencer Nadolsky at some point, that it's the insulin resistance that is the atherogenic component rather than the LDL itself. And that is the main question. That is what we are all debating. That is what we are discussing, whether it is the LDL particle itself, in which case perhaps higher numbers of LDL particles or smaller numbers of particles would be bad, versus the insulin resistance, which is causing the LDL to look a certain way. That is the real problem. I would suggest it's the latter. And it's not the LDL particles, it's the insulin resistance.
Exactly. And many of these numbers tend to be proxies for insulin resistance. For example, triglyceride to HDL ratio is essentially a marker of insulin sensitivity. And I guess we should note with the LDLP, the reference range is 1140 to 1410. So my value at 3500 is well outside of the reference range.
Right. And then the NMR also calculates your LDL size. So you've had, whether or not we think this is valuable, you've had an LDL size of 22.3. I guess it depends what size we're looking at. This has 223 angstroms.
Yeah, angstrom, it's move the decimal place to get the nanometers.
Nanometers, right. And they characterize that as a pattern size A. So that's an LDL that's a reasonable size particle.
Yep.
And then you also get numbers of HDL. So what have you seen for your HDL particle number?
Yeah, my HDL particle number was well above the optimal range, which was 43. And it's worth noting that you can actually calculate these out to get a number of particles. So these are measured in nanomoles for LDL particle count and micromoles for HDL particle count, and that's per liter. So you have 5 liters of blood. We know a mole is Avogadro's number. Do you know it, Paul? Let's see.
6.02 times 10 to the 23rd.
Boom, you got it. You remembered your chemistry class.
Chemistry major right here, bro.
So if you multiply those out, you get something like 3 times 10 to the 18, which is quintillions of LDL particles. And if you do the same math for HDL particle numbers, you get something like 100 quintillion, which is 1 times 10 to the 20 particles. So you have 2 orders of magnitude more HDL particles in your circulation than you do LDL particles, which is kind of interesting to know.
And you mentioned to me something that I thought was interesting, that HDL carries at least 30% of the cholesterol in your circulation.
It does.
So an HDL particle, what's the size of an HDL particle relative to the size of an LDL particle?
It's considerably smaller and considerably more dense, hence the handy name of high-density lipoprotein.
Interesting. And we're talking in esoteric nuances right now, but I'll try and make it relevant for people. The reason we're talking about things like Avogadro's number and these numbers of LDL particles is this. If we actually look at the number of particles of LDL, let's just take LDL, which is broadly considered to be bad cholesterol, but I think it needs to be rebranded, frankly, as immunologic cholesterol. But they all serve immunologic roles, so perhaps that's not accurate enough. But we look at LDL, which has been demonized as quote unquote bad cholesterol. We have everyone, whether they have an LDL of 60 milligrams per deciliter or an LDL of 400 milligrams per deciliter or an LDL particle number of 700 or an LDL particle number of 3,500, everyone in that category has an LDL on the order of 10 to the 18th particles in their body. That is a heck of a lot of LDL particles. And mainstream lipid thinking would suggest that by lowering LDL from perhaps 3 times 10 to the 18th to 1 times 10 to the 18th, you are going to reduce your risk of atherosclerosis. And just in terms of basic intuitive thinking, this doesn't make sense to me because 1 times 10 to the 18th is still a heck of a lot of LDL particles. That is not an insignificant number of LDL particles in your blood. And so if LDL were truly atherogenic in and of itself, if LDL were truly toxic to the endothelium in vivo, in its native form, 1 times 10 to the 18th of something that's poisonous is still a big, big number. So it's never made sense to me why people think that they're reducing it is going to make a big deal. And if you listen to the podcast I did with Nadir Ali, there was a trial that was done with both statins and PCSK9 inhibitors, in which the LDL was reduced to extremely low levels, at least in terms of milligrams per deciliter. Those patients had around 30 milligrams per deciliter of LDL, and they still had significant levels of atherosclerosis, even with that much LDL floating around. So the idea that lowering LDL is the key to getting rid of atherosclerosis does not hold up to examination, in my opinion. And I think it's important to note that there are so many LDL particles in our body, and 1 times 10 to the 18th versus 3 times 10 to the 18th is a big difference. And 1 times 10 to the 18th is still a big number. If that particle were dangerous, that's still going to be a big problem.
Yep. These are really, really big numbers.
And HDL, interestingly, is not felt to be an atherogenic particle. I don't think Nathan and I believe that LDL is atherogenic either, but HDL is classically not considered to be an atherogenic particle, and yet it's present in 2 orders of magnitude higher, that is 100 times higher amount than LDL in the body. And it carries 30% of the cholesterol in the body, and it's a smaller particle than LDL.
Yep.
So why would it, if LDL is atherogenic, why is HDL not atherogenic? And of course, neither of us believes that LDL is atherogenic, but again, there's these interesting arguments of just, if we're thinking about first principles, like how is this even possible that, why is an HDL particle not toxic to the endothelium when people are claiming that LDL is toxic to the endothelium? Doesn't make sense to me.
It is pretty strange.
Pretty strange.
But to, be fair to the alternative hypothesis, the idea is that the fact that LDL contains an ApoB lipoprotein and HDL contains an ApoA lipoprotein is the key difference there.
Right. And so it's the ApoB lipoprotein perhaps. But again, I don't really buy it. And if
I don't buy it either.
People should listen to the podcast that I did recently with Tommy Wood, which will be out sometime around this one. I'm not sure exactly when these are going to be released, but one of the themes in that podcast was that in the setting of insulin sensitivity, there is probably no problem to having a high LDL, and I would agree with that pretty clearly.
And speaking of high LDL and endothelial damage from LDL, I guess we should talk about the Ox-LDL test. I had this done once, and my result was greater than 135, which is measured in nonsensical units. And essentially, from what we can see, this basically, you would agree this tracks with LDLP more or less, right?
That's what I've seen. And maybe we can talk a little about my numbers briefly, which will help clarify this. But so in terms of my lipid panel, I have definitely seen the same thing, that oxidized LDL tracks directly with LDL. I did not include oxidized LDL in any of those lab tests that I thought would be valuable. So what I have seen, and this is something that I had a conversation with Dave Feldman about, so hat tip to him, our test for oxidized LDL as we currently are doing it, as I understand it, is an antibody test or an ELISA, so an enzyme-linked immunoassay that will detect a positive oxidized LDL if there's even one phospholipid on the surface of the LDL molecule that is oxidized.
I believe it's actually the protein that they test for.
The oxidized
it's
ApoB.
Of any of the proteins on
Right.
the LDL, from my understanding.
And so the problem with that is you cannot get a sense of how much of the phospholipids may be oxidized on the surface of the LDL. And though people have suggested this is a valuable marker, it doesn't seem to be a valuable marker. It just seems to track with LDL. And my LDL numbers were originally a little bit lower than Nathan's, so I can actually do a calculation. But in seeing my patients, what I have noticed is that predictably, the oxidized LDL is always 0.04, is always basically 4%, or maybe 0.4% of the LDL particle number. So if you take the oxidized LDL and you divide by the LDLP, you always get 0.04 or thereabouts. I've gotten 0.35 or 0.41, but it's very predictable that as the LDL goes up, the oxidized LDL goes up. And I have seen that in my clients repeatedly. And so you will see the oxidized LDL track with LDL. I don't think it's a measure of excessive oxidation. Now, perhaps we could hypothesize that an oxidized LDL that were significantly more than 0.04 of your total LDL particle number would be a problem. But again, it's just a hypothesis. But I consistently see 0.04, so I guess 4% of the LDL is oxidized.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see those values in a smoker or a diabetic and see if you see discordance in that ratio. See
if that oxidized LDL goes up.
If you're doing all the right things, I think it's not worth spending the money on that test. It doesn't tell you anything useful.
Nor should people be dismayed if they get an oxidized LDL with a high. If they get an oxidized LDL and they have a high LDLP, they should not be dismayed about that because it's going to track. They can do the calculation where you divide oxidized LDL by LDLP, and it will probably be about 0.04 or 0.35. So that is quite an interesting thing. Now, I'll just talk about some of my numbers. I had my lipids done in February of 2019. At that time, my LDL particle number was 1637. And my, let me see if they had HDL on here.
I see your HDLP was 49.
Yes. My HDLP at that time was 49 micromole per liter. And my small LDLP was 233 nanomole per liter, which is low. And at that time, my oxidized LDL was 79. So if we do the quick calculation, I think it comes out to be about 0.04 or a little bit less than that. So that was my numbers then. Now, interestingly, my lipid numbers went up. When I did that one in February, I'd been on the carnivore diet for probably 7 or 8 months. And now I've been on a carnivore diet for about a year. And my most recent numbers look a little more like Nathan's. My LDL is now 349. That is an LDL-C direct. My total cholesterol is 495 milligrams per deciliter. My HDL-C is 86 milligrams per deciliter, and my triglycerides were 48 milligrams per deciliter. So my LDL has gone up as well. Looking at my LDL particle number, it's now above 3,500. My oxidized LDL has gone up in tandem, and that is those probably correlate directly. My HDL particle number is now 53.5 micromole per liter. So you can see my HDL has gone up quite a bit. So it's the same sort of pattern there, that the LDL goes up, or at least mine did. I certainly look like what Dave would call a lean mass hyperresponder now. And my LDL is high, but as we'll talk about later, neither Nathan nor I have other markers which are concerning to us and give the context for all of this, which would be insulin sensitivity markers.
Yep. And another one that's probably not worth getting that seems to track with LDLP would be Lp(PLA2), which is lipoprotein-associated phospholipase.
A2.
Which lipidologists in the medical community will claim tracks with vascular inflammation, but I'm not entirely clear on that. Do you have any more thoughts on that?
It actually tracks with LDL, as you said. So as your LDL goes up, Lp(PLA2) will go up. I had a conversation with Tom Dayspring from True Health, and eminent mainstream lipidologist, who told me that he thought there was no evidence that Lp(PLA2) was valuable as a cardiac risk marker either. So he was even in agreement with us there. So
Well, there you go. Don't spend the money on that one.
don't spend the money on LPPLA2. So what else have you gotten? Because I've gotten some pretty interesting lipid stuff to complement this. You have as well, Nathan. What else have you gotten in terms of lipids that's kind of like extracurricular and interesting?
Yeah, I got the synthesis and reuptake markers of cholesterol and desmosterol, and also the plant sterols looking at campesterol and sitosterol. My synthesis and uptake were all elevated, which I guess is to be expected when all the other markers are elevated. I don't know if you want to have anything to chime in there. My cholesterol was almost 10, and the reference range is like 2 to 3. So I really exceeded that. And desmosterol was almost 4, and the reference range for that is around 1.
Yeah. So these are interesting markers. So cholesterol can be elevated when there's increased cholesterol synthesis. Desmosterol, again, these are kind of esoteric markers. So some people are probably having their heads swim with like all this funny names and stuff, but desmosterol is probably the best marker of cholesterol synthesis. And in the podcast with Tommy Wood that I did recently, he talked about desmosterol synthesis. That podcast was talking about Alzheimer's disease, dementia, the effect that statins could have on the synthesis of cholesterol in the brain and the effect that might have on long-term cognition and memory. But the desmosterol is an indication of how much cholesterol our bodies are making. And in carnivores, people on ketosis, I always see an elevated desmosterol because these pathways are being activated, and these pathways are shared between ketogenic pathways and cholesterol pathways. That is what happens. We make more cholesterol. That's why LDL goes up on these diets. So the desmosterol is not something to worry about. It's going to be high. I don't think it's something that most people need to get, but it's an interesting thing. It's probably relevant if you're on a statin to get a desmosterol level, because a low desmosterol level would be problematic. And as I talk about in the podcast with Tommy Wood, the brain has its own supply of cholesterol. It's not made in the periphery and transported across the blood-brain barrier. So if you have low peripheral desmosterol, you worry that if the statin is crossing the blood-brain barrier, which is what it would do if it were a lipophilic statin, it would inhibit the production of desmosterol there. Inhibiting the production of cholesterol in the brain would be a very bad thing because it's needed for membranes and cellular metabolism.
And I guess just some background on those markers. All of the cholesterol and desmosterol are intermediates in cholesterol synthesis, right? So we're basically measuring bits along the pathway to making cholesterol. Cholesterol being a very important molecule that humans use for a variety of things. The other two molecules we talked about are sort of interesting, the campesterol and the sitosterol. These are plant sterols. Mm-hmm. So they'll give us a sense of how much we are absorbing plant sterols. And that is useful for people if they do have plants in their diet. They could see if they are hyper absorbing plant sterols. Now, I'm writing a part of my book right now where I talk about the possibility that plant sterols are even more atherogenic or could contribute to inflammation. I don't think we fully know at this point. I don't know that either Nathan or I believe that cholesterol itself is an atherogenic sterol, but there is some evidence that plant sterols could be dangerous for humans. And this would make sense to me because they're sterols that our body doesn't really want and hasn't seen. There was this kind of misguided effort for a while to put plant sterols into butter and other margarines, things like this, to decrease LDL. Yikes.
And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I don't think we want to be putting a whole lot of plant sterols in our body. I've even heard Tom Dayspring say that they are atherogenic, and I'm looking for the research on that.
Yeah, I think I have seen research showing that. Curiously, mine were in the normal reference range, whereas yours were very low. I do, I'm not as 100% carnivore as you are. I do eat some dark chocolate and some coffee. So I'm curious. I was trying to find some research about whether those sterols are found in those products that I, tend to eat occasionally. But, maybe I'll do a break from coffee and chocolate, and we'll see if my plant sterols decrease.
I bet they would. I've seen that in people. When I see the plant sterols moderately elevated, or at least in the middle of the range, or even some people are hyper absorbers, it's usually from coffee, because a lot of people I work with don't have a whole lot of plants, but some people do. But it's something to notice, especially as we get to have more research about the fact that they may be atherogenic.
Yep. What should we talk about next? Do you want to move on to hormones?
I want to talk a little bit about some of the other inflammatory markers.
All right.
So one of the markers that I've had on the True Health test is, again, I think it's an esoteric marker. It's asymmetric dimethylarginine and symmetric dimethylarginine and L-arginine. You haven't had any of these on your panels, have you?
I did, I believe. I think I had Yeah, I had SDMA, ADMA, and L-arginine, and MPO.
I very rarely see the endothelial function markers, asymmetric dimethylarginine, symmetric dimethylarginine, abnormal. I haven't seen it on a lot of people, but I also don't see a lot of people with frank metabolic syndrome. So I don't think these are necessarily valuable, but what we're looking at here is arginine metabolites. Arginine also being a precursor for nitric oxide, which is used for vasodilatation. But were all of your markers in the normal reference range?
Yeah, mine were smack dab in the ideal part of the reference range.
Yeah. So I think that the lipids, which we've talked about at some level of detail now, have to all be interpreted in the context of inflammation and insulin resistance. And so there are some inflammatory markers which I think are valuable. And these would be hsCRP, myeloperoxidase, fibrinogen, homocysteine. And so hsCRP is something that I've talked a little bit about before. I had a great conversation with Dave and Siobhan about this. You can check out that podcast. The takeaway from that one for me was that hsCRP, which stands for high sensitivity C-reactive protein, can be elevated by all sorts of things. And so if it's elevated, we have to think about, was there recent exercise? Was there a sunburn? Are we sick? But generally speaking, the people I work with on ketogenic and carnivore diets should have very low hsCRP. Mine has been less than 0.03 on multiple occasions. And generally, I will say that there is no evidence that a carnivore diet elevates inflammatory markers like hsCRP. What's your hsCRP,
Yep,
Nathan?
mine measured is less than 0.02, which is the bottom of the scale for their measurement. And this last test was 0.05. And I had been doing more resistance training. I took a break 24 hours beforehand, but I could chalk up the minor increase to just being broken down a little bit from working out.
Dave and Siobhan have done a lot of work measuring their CRP. Siobhan mentioned that hers has been elevated after a sunburn. Dave has done it after ultramarathons and runs and seen it quite high. So if you are going to measure hsCRP, which is a valuable metric, it should be first morning fasting, and you don't want to have done a hard workout the night before.
Yeah, I would say potentially a day, 2 days, 3 days, if you really want to get a good accurate measure to make sure it's not, especially if you're doing heavy lifting or intense exercise.
Yeah. And you certainly don't want to go in the gym the morning of and do a workout and then check your hsCRP, because it won't be valuable.
Yeah, that will not be a useful measure.
But if hsCRP is elevated and you're doing all those things, you should probably keep an eye on it and understand where it could be coming from, because evidence of inflammation is a valuable thing to track, and we want to try and get rid of it. The other measures on here are myeloperoxidase, which is another measure of inflammation. That generally is something that's produced by neutrophils, one of the cell lineages in our bodies, which we can talk a little bit about when we talk about the CBC. And fibrinogen, which is a clotting factor, and homocysteine. So my myeloperoxidase was most recently 193. The fibrinogen was 363. Those are all within normal. Have any of those ever been elevated for you?
No, my fibrinogen was 240 to 294, and the myeloperoxidase I got was 153. So I've got you beat a little bit there.
You do have me beat there.
Slightly lower values.
Let's talk a little bit about homocysteine. People should refer to the podcast I did with Ben Lynch if they're interested in homocysteine. Homocysteine tends to come up a lot. And the reason I mention this as something that I think is valuable is twofold. One of them is that homocysteine is an indicator of folate status, and the other one is an indicator of riboflavin status. I talked about this in more detail with Ben, but my MTHFR, which is methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase, genotype is 677C to T homozygous, which means that my MTHFR enzyme is a little sluggish. But as we know, if I am getting enough riboflavin and enough folate, my MTHFR enzyme will work normally. So I want to mention to people that I am homozygous for the most severe polymorphism of MTHFR, and I don't take any methylfolate. I just make sure to get a reasonable amount of riboflavin in my diet through organ meats, and get the active form of folate in my diet, which is L-methylfolate, which I believe exists in animal meats. And my homocysteine has been 7 on multiple occasions. Though the reference range for homocysteine goes up to 13, I think that's ludicrous. And in any of my patients or clients, if their homocysteine is above 8, I will recommend looking at folate and riboflavin status closely.
That makes a lot of sense. Mine also is in that same range. It was from 6 to 7.2, and the latest was 6.5 micromoles per liter.
Do you know your MTHFR?
I think it's the one that's 66% effective, but I think folks should check out Tommy's talk that he just did at AHS, where he looked at the normal distribution of homocysteine levels in people with the different polymorphisms, excluding the worst polymorphism, there's almost no difference in homocysteine levels across the population, which probably it wouldn't stand out because of how metabolically broken and nutrient deplete most people are. But it seems like these genes, if you're eating even kind of acceptably, don't have a massive impact.
Except I would say, to that I would add MTHFR. If you have the 677 polymorphism.
Yeah, if you have both of the bad polymorphisms and the T to T and the I forget what the other
one. So it's 677 and 1298.
Yeah, if you have both of those in the bad configuration, then it can be problematic. But that is pretty rare.
I would say that in Mediterranean and Hispanic populations, it's not rare to have 677 polymorphisms. But basically, you don't even have to check your genetics. You can just check your homocysteine. And if your homocysteine is above 8, you probably need more folate and riboflavin.
Yep.
And the thing I'll add here that is interesting, just as a commentary, plant folate is dihydrofolate. And that is the type of folate that we need to process through the MTHFR enzyme to make methylfolate. But animals have the same folate cycle and they make methylfolate. So it is my suspicion, my hypothesis, my postulate here, timestamp it, is that animal meat is going to have L-methylfolate. And I've never seen this researched. I've never seen anybody check it, but I think the folate in liver is likely to be L-methylfolate. And my labs reflect that. I do not take methylfolate. I want to correct it all with food if I can. I'm not hung up on that if I can't do it. But in this case, my homocysteine has been quite low in the very optimal range with only liver and organ meats and my carnivore diet. I will also mention that my homocysteine has been as high as 12 or 13 in the past when I was eating a more standard diet and was not getting enough of those nutrients. And at times I have lowered my homocysteine with methylfolate supplements, but I choose not to take it now. And like I said, I think that if you're eating animal products, you will get methylfolate.
Makes sense. And I don't eat quite as much liver as you do. And I don't have quite as severe of polymorphism, but what I am eating seems to be working for my homocysteine.
Yeah, your homocysteine is fine. All right. So I think with that, we should let's move out of the lipids. Hopefully that's a good summary. We talked about most of that stuff. Yeah, pretty well. And let's move into hormones because you've had that checked and you had kind of an interesting hormonal pattern. I
have, yeah. So I guess we could start with the stress hormone, cortisol. That one's pretty easy and interesting. I had that measured in serum. The reference range is 2 to 20. And I was right in the middle at 8.2 and 9.2. So that's not too interesting. But I guess if folks have elevated cortisol, I don't think we had that on the list, but that might be one.
It's in the hormone panel. So
worth adding.
I'll expand here for people. When they're getting a hormone panel, I would order the following things. I would order morning cortisol. I would order free and total testosterone. I would order sex hormone binding globulin. I would order estradiol. I would order DHEA. I would order LH, which is luteinizing hormone, FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone. I would order prolactin. I would also order DHT, which is dihydrotestosterone. And I think that would be it in terms of hormones. But the hormone panel is extensive as well. Again, you could get a Dutch, which is a dried urine hormone profile, but those are not very good at looking at androgens. There is a polymorphism in I believe it's the FUT2 gene, but I could be wrong about that, whereby some people actually do not secrete testosterone in their urine. They can have a normal testosterone in the serum and a low testosterone in the urine. And so urine testosterone is not accurate. So the only thing I maybe would add to that is a PTH, which is a parathyroid hormone, which gives you a sense of your calcium metabolism. But if you get those hormones in the serum, you will get a pretty good sense of what's going on. And if you need more, you can go to the dried urine.
Gotcha. So the next one that I guess we can talk about is sex hormone binding globulin. Mine was pretty high. It ranged from 45 to 57. The reference range goes up to 50. And I believe on your last podcast with Tommy, he mentioned that it essentially tracks with insulin sensitivity.
It does track with insulin sensitivity. I would not characterize your SHBG as high. I would characterize it as normal. Women tend to have higher levels of sex hormone binding globulin. And perhaps that's something that I should mention in this podcast, that the reference ranges for some of these things in the hormones will be different for men than women. But SHBG, if you look at the differential diagnosis, there's a differential of high SHBG and a differential of low SHBG. Basically, a low sex hormone binding globulin is something that people get when they are hyperthyroid, I believe, and insulin resistant. And a high sex hormone binding globulin is something that people can get when they have hypothyroid or they are insulin sensitive. And so if the sex hormone binding globulin is out of the range or in the range, then we can look for those causes. But most of the time I see it within the range. The reason we think about sex hormone binding globulin is because it binds up free hormones, and there is the possibility that free hormones are the active hormones. And so we can't just get total hormones. We have to get the free and the total, and the SHBG helps us look at that. And the SHBG, the sex hormone binding globulin, can tell us if there's a major issue going on in other hormonal systems or other problems.
Makes sense. The next one is total testosterone. Mine started off very low. I was at 261 nanograms a deciliter and went up to, now I'm at 731 nanograms a deciliter. And I guess I'd chalk that up to, I was doing quite a lot more fasting and was eating a lot less calories then. So I think my testosterone is pretty low. And then my free testosterone went from 32 picograms a milliliter to 113. So I almost quadrupled my free testosterone. And I guess it's worth noting that the total testosterone counts the testosterone that's bound to albumin, I believe. And the free testosterone is believed to be the generally or active hormonal form, but it's not clear if that's 100% of the case. I don't know, you want to?
Yeah, the total is going to be the testosterone that's bound to albumin and SHBG and the free. And then the free is just the testosterone that's not bound to either albumin or SHBG.
Makes sense.
When people are looking at hormonal numbers, pay attention to the units. Nathan is giving his units for total in nanograms per deciliter and free in picograms per ml. So some of these numbers may sound a little different.
Yeah, and I've actually had these be in the same unit with different reference ranges and different results from different labs. So these aren't particularly comparable, I don't think. I would just say check against the reference range from what I've seen, because I have one test that also claimed to be in picograms a milliliter and was a totally different scale than the other ones that I have. Totally different order of magnitude.
Yeah. I'm just looking at the SHBG for people. I think I reversed it. High SHBG is hyperthyroid. Low SHBG is hypothyroid. Low SHBG, the differential diagnosis also includes sleep apnea, insulin resistance, like we said, hypothyroid, diabetes, and other conditions like acromegaly, which is a growth hormone secreting tumor, can cause that. High SHBG, we think of anorexia, alcoholic cirrhosis, hyperthyroid, primary biliary cirrhosis, low gonads, hypogonadism, and testosterone replacement therapy can create a high SHBG. So again, that's a little bit of a nuanced diagnosis if the SHBG is off, but it is interesting to look at those numbers. So I think the biggest question people are going to be asking here, Nathan, is, and you talked about it, but just expound on it a little bit. What the heck did you do to quadruple your testosterone?
Yeah, I wish I knew all the answers, but I think, a lot of these things are difficult to tell what the heck's going on, because it's the pituitary, thyroid, gonadal axis. So you have to look at a lot of different measurements to figure out what the heck's actually going on. So when I was trying to troubleshoot this, you suggested that I also get LH, FSH, and prolactin to see what was going on with those. Because you can have, if you have low luteinizing hormone, which is the hormone produced by the pituitary gland, that's generally showing that you have what would be considered secondary hypogonadism, which means that the problem resides in your brain, not with the testes. So if you have normal LH, that means your body is telling your testes to make testosterone. And if you have low testosterone in that case, your testes aren't making it. That would be primary hypogonadism.
Sound like a doctor, bro.
Secondary would be when, you got to look into this stuff when you figure all this stuff out. When you have normal low LH, that means your pituitary gland is not making it. And that ties into potentially like nutrient intake status, sleep, all that kind of stuff that's going to impact the brain side. So I think I was just calorically restricting myself into secondary hypogonadism, which was not so fun. So prior to this test, I way upped my calorie intake, and I was, and I put in room darkening shades, and I got a chili pad, and I've made too many interventions to really say what I did, but my sleep's been better. My food intake has been greater, and that resulted in higher testosterone, and interestingly, a still low LH. So go figure.
That puzzles me. I don't make sense of that, but let's just say, so we don't confuse people, I'll just recapitulate some of that. So the LH and the FSH are something I always get with testosterone. People will go to their doctor and they'll just get a total testosterone or a free and they'll see it low. And if they're men, they'll get testosterone replacement right away. And I think that's crazy. We need to be looking for the cause of the low testosterone before we're supplementing men of all ages with testosterone. This is nuts. Literally, that's a good pun. I like it. But if you are sleep deprived, your LH and FSH will go down. Your pituitary will not signal to your testicles to make testosterone. That is correctable. You get better sleep and your body will make testosterone. There are many people in residency who are going to have low testosterone, for instance, residency for medical school, because they're not sleeping enough. And as Nathan is suggesting, I've seen in clients not eating enough, lots of fasting. This will affect your testosterone. So if there's a low testosterone, recheck it and make sure you're getting more calories. Maybe think about how long you were fasting before the blood test. If you get testosterone in the middle of a 5-day fast, it will be low. It will be low.
It's also, I don't think I noticed any subjective difference in libido or anything like that from having a testosterone of 261 versus 730, which is on its own kind of interesting.
It is an interesting thing. And I think that the missing part of this equation is tissue sensitivity. And I have not seen a lot of great evidence for this yet, but I would love to see it because I see people, I hear the same thing from people. I don't get worried about testosterone unless it's lower than the reference range and people are having symptoms of erectile dysfunction for men or low libido for men or even for women too. And the reference ranges for women are going to be totally different for testosterone, but this is relevant as well because women can have low libido related to low testosterone and it can be related to the same things. Not enough calories, anorexia, overstressing with exercise, overstress in their life, poor sleep. It's similar, just different reference ranges. But if people have good libido, they have good sexual function in man, erectile dysfunction in women, libido and no pain with intercourse, then yeah, that's probably this may not be an issue there. And it's important to think about like, what's the sex drive like? And there is a tissue sensitivity issue here. I am sure of it. And I think like so many things in the future with ketogenic diets, we will learn tissue sensitivity changes. And we'll talk about this when we get to the thyroid. But
yeah, that's definitely been shown, at least in muscles. For building muscle, it's not the free or total testosterone that matters. It was the density of androgen receptors on the muscle. I don't know the reference off the top of my head, but that was something that I saw on Twitter recently from one of these muscle researchers.
That you have to find me that study.
Will do.
Okay. So yeah, it's probably the density of the receptors in the brain, right? For libido and the density of the receptors everywhere for testosterone. And that is something we cannot measure with a blood test. So the takeaway with regard to testosterone, because I think a lot of people want to know about this, is that check your levels, look at the SHBG, also look at the estradiol, look at the LH, look at the FSH, make sure the prolactin is not high because there can be prolactin secreting adenomas in the brain that can affect the formation of testosterone. But generally, if you have good sexual function, if you have good libido, if you're able to maintain muscle mass and your testosterone is at the low end of normal, don't stress it. It's not
don't lose more sleep over it. So
it's not a contest. It's not a contest. If you have good function, that's what matters. We cannot measure the density of receptors on your muscles, on your testicles, on your brain, or in anywhere else where testosterone is going to work. It's magic. And if you feel good and these are within normal, I wouldn't worry about it. If they're low, then you have to think like, was I fasting too much? Am I not getting enough calories? Am I not sleeping enough? Especially if LH and FSH are low. But we cannot just look at free and total testosterone and give someone testosterone replacement therapy.
Yeah, I think that's a bad move.
It's a bad move. Personally, my testosterone has been kind of similar to Nathan's. I've had a total testosterone that's been around 500 to 700, and the free tends to be, again, my units are a little different. The lab that I've used uses slightly different units. My free has been between 5 and 7, which is all in the reference range of the lab that I use, which is the units are nanograms per deciliter for the free testosterone. And I do notice that if I am stressed, if I am overworked out, if I have not slept well, my testosterone will drop a little bit. My FSH and LH don't move around a whole lot, but I know that if I go to get my testosterone checked, and I've been working real hard, doing podcasts for you guys, I've been crushing it in the gym or something, it might be a little lower. I don't get stressed about it. I just know that this is how I'm tracking. And I think that with a lot of these measures, you want to get them over time. If they're consistently low, then we look for a problem.
Speaking of time, testosterone secretion varies with time, and it's very important to get it tested probably within 2 to 3 hours of waking.
Yes.
And towards the end of the day, testosterone will be lower. So it's generally highest in the morning And that'll obviously depend on your sleep-wake time when that's, ideal to measure. But if you Google around for testosterone over time, you can find a graph of, they measured men, and
diurnal pattern.
It's a pretty big pattern, pretty big swing, 20, 30%, something like that.
Yeah. This is probably why people get morning wood. Well, men get morning wood because there's a peak in the morning. And I'll say there's also a diurnal pattern for cortisol. AM cortisol should be highest in the morning. That's part of our circadian rhythm. And so you want to measure cortisol in the morning, or know that if you're measuring cortisol in the evening, it's going to be different. And this is where we get these sort of salivary cortisol panels that give you 24 hours of cortisol. There is a diurnal pattern.
And I guess another thing we should throw in while we're talking about time and testing would be coffee. Probably don't drink coffee the day of at the very least, and probably 2 to 3 days beforehand, because that can throw off your triglycerides and potentially increase cortisol.
Don't drink coffee in general, people.
Or don't drink coffee in general.
Avoid it. The other thing I'll mention here is DHT, which is dihydrotestosterone. My dihydrotestosterone has been 48 and 46. And interestingly, this is something that I learned. So one of my friends is Brian Johnson, who owns Ancestral Supplements. And he told me that there's a pigment in salmon roe which can actually inhibit the formation of DHT. And anecdotally, I paused on salmon roe and my DHT went up. I'm not sure I noticed a major difference in terms of subjective symptomatology or libido or anything, but my DHT did go up when I stopped eating salmon roe. And people will say, oh, he's not eating salmon roe anymore. I still eat salmon roe from time to time. I just don't eat it every day.
What was your change in the DHT?
I think that the previous DHT was in the 20s. It was probably about 25, and now it's 45.
And is this measuring in the synthetic pathway? I'm not familiar with DHT.
Yeah, testosterone gets converted to DHT.
Gotcha.
Yep. And the pigment in salmon roe, I'm blanking on the name of it. Will you look it up real quick?
Yeah, I can look it up.
It's, we'll think of it. It's also in like shrimp and things like this. There's this pigment that people will know. I'm just brain spazzing right now. Can inhibit the formation of DHT. So that's an interesting thing. If people have a low DHT, sometimes think, oh, maybe you're eating salmon roe. It actually harkens back to a conversation I had with my good friend Chris Bell many months ago on his podcast. He said, is it actually seasonal or evolutionarily consistent to eat salmon roe every day? And I thought, you know what? It's probably not. Maybe I shouldn't be eating it that much. I think it's a great source of highly bioavailable DHA, which we will talk about when we talk about the omega-3s. And I don't eat it every day anymore, but I do use it as an omega source from time to time. So the other thing that I'll mention is the IGF-1, which is really interesting for people to see. Many people will criticize carnivore diets, saying that the IGF-1 is going to be super high, or that you're going to trigger this insulin-like growth factor to high levels. And I've had my level checked twice. Again, this is kind of in the extracurricular section. On the most recent blood test, my IGF-1 was 96. So anyone that says that eating a carnivore diet is going to spike your IGF-1 is cuckoo in the coconut and their banana pancakes. And I've had an IGF-1 measured, I think another time in like the mid 150s. It probably has to do with the fact that I was fasting for this blood test. And so when I'm fasting, it's going to be a little lower, but eating a carnivorous diet does not raise your IGF-1, people. It does not. Eating a lot of carbohydrates will raise your IGF-1.
Yep. Mine was 122 and 146. And my lab also gave me a Z-score, which I think is age-adjusted population standard deviation score. And mine was minus 0.09 and minus 0.04. So I was below 0.04 standard deviations below the population for my age.
Eating a ton of animal products. So this is a whole separate conversation about mTOR, activation of mTOR, IGF-1, but I think it's pretty clear that mTOR is not overactivated eating an animal-based diet. I've talked about that on multiple other podcasts. The take-home message is that both leucine and insulin and exercise can activate mTOR, and that insulin is a much bigger trigger for mTOR than leucine, and that IGF-1 levels are totally normal in people on carnivorous diets. They're not super high, but the way to raise your IGF-1 is to eat a ton of carbohydrates or a bunch of dairy.
Yep, and you could raise it by eating more frequently. So I think it's reasonably a good idea to eat in a limited eating window instead of eating all the day.
And I think this goes back to the idea that we need to have anabolic signals. We need to turn on mTOR sometimes. We just don't want to turn it on all the time.
Yep. It's
a pulsatile thing. It's a sort of a cycle.
So I guess insulin-like growth factor, let's talk about insulin itself. So I had mine measured at 1 IU per milliliter and 1.9, and then most recently 4.9. The ideal here is having insulin less than 9. And I think insulin can actually be pretty pulsatile, so it might actually be good to look at another panel that Paul mentioned, which was, what was the other one you mentioned? C-peptide. That's a longer-lived
C-peptide, yep.
metabolite related to insulin.
Yep, we can talk about that.
But an insulin of 1 puts you at a very, very low HOMA-IR, which is the homeostatic model of insulin resistance, and generally super catabolic state.
So if there were one test out of this whole panel that I would think would be important, it would be fasting insulin.
Yep.
And I think that is the one test that physicians do not do for people. But yes, my fasting insulin has been equally low, 3 to 2, 2 to 3, the whole time I've been doing it. And it is so important to know your fasting insulin. It's probably one of the best measures of insulin sensitivity. C-peptide my C-peptide was 1. Did you have a C-peptide measured?
I did not have a C-peptide.
I've had my C-peptide measured at 0.9 and 1. The insulin units are micro units per ml. The C-peptide is nanograms per ml. And C-peptide, like Nathan is saying, is a little bit more stable measure of the same thing. Insulin does have this sinusoidal pattern on a minute to 10 minute basis. So you can't quite tell. And so I usually do, for my clients, I'll do an insulin and a C-peptide together, especially if the insulin looks at high end of normal. My goal for insulin for people is less than 4. When I see 5, when I see 6, when I see 9, I think, no, there's something going on here. There's insulin resistance. And you can triangulate insulin resistance looking at triglycerides and looking at hemoglobin A1C and looking at fasting glucose. And we'll talk about those. But as Nathan is saying, the HOMA-IR is a calculated score.
Yep. That's just based on fasting insulin and fasting glucose. And you can find a calculator online. I think it's multiply one by 21 and divide by the other or something. And mine was below the reference range.